with our breath work, right? See if you can find a spot where you're not going to be distracted. Although there's something valuable in the distractions in and of themselves. But as much as you can, see if you can minimize them, just as I have all these people around me. Um, so do your best, set up your environment, right? In regards to your physical landscape, support it. Get a pillow, something firm that lifts your butt up. I have my firm pillow here, a nice little cushion. You're also welcome to use your yoga block, particularly if it's a foam one. Um, Sometimes I'll use my block, but I have cork ones, and over time they can start to become a distraction, an unnecessary distraction because they're so hard. So take that um, kind of this idea and find something appropriate just to get your butt up a little bit higher so you can sit comfortably on the floor, right? And the higher you get, the idea behind that is to find a place so that your pelvis is neutral, right? Oftentimes, when there's tightness in the lower back or any uh, tightness and clenching in the hips, it tends to pull the pelvis, right? Especially like it's noticeable for those of us who, when they sit on the floor, kind of sit like this, and the spine is rounded. It's because something is yanking on the pelvis, um, displacing the pelvis, which then in turn um, informs the rest of the spine, right? So, maybe for like a minute, this is fine for some people, but over longer and longer periods of time, you're going to start to feel segments of your body that will begin to feel fatigued, right? Unnecessarily. So do yourself a favor, get yourself seated on something that elevates your seat. And you can also do this sitting down, right? So you can also grab a chair, and the idea is the same. You want to get the pelvis in a relaxed, neutral position so that sitting up tall feels like the most natural thing to do, right? It's not like you're sucking your abdomen in or engaging the muscles that run along your back or engaging the hips or legs or anything, right? So somewhere where to sit naturally feels natural, right? It doesn't have to look any particular way, but the main key thing is to get your pelvis balanced, right? So um, get your supports and get that going. Um, and so a couple more things. We will be engaging in breath work, right? Today we'll revisit our practice of the four-part breath, or also known as box breathing, where the four parts of the breath, the inhale, the hold at the top of your inhale, the exhalation, followed by that hold at the bottom, are all equal lengths and durations. A couple of things to note with that is oftentimes the inhalation is much shorter than the exhalation, right? So with knowing that, or kind of having that in the back of your head, see if you can slow down your inhalation to stretch it out a little bit longer. And then likewise, coming down on the other end, see if you can quicken just a little bit. It's not like you're forcefully trying to push the air out, but you want to contract the back of your throat, right? Um, uh, if you're familiar with Ujjayi breath, or if you've ever heard somebody say like breathe as if you're fogging up a mirror, right? Like you're fogging up a mirror with your mouth, you go, but you'll do that exhaling through your nose. So it'll be like, I don't know if you could hear that, but you kind of get that idea. I think that's a really excellent example of the feeling that you're producing, right, with the breath and how you're engaging with it, right? So slow down the exhale, or excuse me, speed up the exhale a little bit, and then slow down the inhalation. We'll get started in this practice. Um, we'll set the body up, and then from there, we'll begin to engage with the breath. And at first, you just notice your inhalations, right? Notice the inhales. And then from there, the inhales will become our baseline, right? That'll be our base number. So say, for example, after a couple rounds, you begin to track how many seconds it takes you to inhale. Let's say arbitrarily it's 7 seconds, right? Then from there, you'll start to kind of bolster that around the other segments of the breath, right? So 7 inhale, then it becomes 7 hold, 7 exhale, 7 hold at the bottom, okay? And the intention for today in engaging that is just to kind of reintroduce it and kind of get it familiar, but get your body familiar with the rhythm and the feeling of it. So don't feel compelled, or notice that maybe you strive to be like, oh, I'm going to hold it for 12 seconds, right? I'm going to do 12 seconds or 20 seconds, or oh, this is kind of uncomfortable for me, I'm only going to do it for 3 seconds, right? Notice those kind of thoughts, and see if you can acknowledge that those things are happening, right? Because those things psychologically is normal, something that would happen in this process. But I encourage you just to breathe naturally, right? Especially in that baseline. Just notice the breath. Maybe it's naturally, once you put our attention on it, it's like 6 seconds, right? And that's what it is. We'll just hold it at 6. And we'll do this for about 10 minutes, the whole sequence, okay? So go ahead and get your environment set and ready. Prop yourself up, whether you have a pillow or block or blanket underneath your hips, or you're sitting right on a chair that's the appropriate height, so it allows your feet to touch the floor without bending you at your hips, right? So the thighs feel more like they're going downwards towards the knees out of the hips rather than getting flexed up towards your chest, okay? So sit yourself up, take a moment and find a nice comfortable seat. Push your sit bones down into your base, and then just draw the navel in just very slightly, right? And with the hips slowly becoming more balanced and supported, right? Trace that invitation all the way up your spine, right? That the shoulders rest easy down the back. Okay? And then now let's look at the arms. Straighten your arms at your thighs, at your knees, right? If you're sitting down here. If you're sitting on the chair, it'll be more straight down the thighs. Okay? And then engage through your arms. Spread your fingers as wide as you can. Begin to feel the tinglings in your fingertips. Feel and sense the space, the webbings between each finger. And then become very intentional about straining the arms. So engage the backs of your arms. Your triceps are firm. And then now from here, pick any random finger, doesn't matter which, touch it to your thumb. Let this intentional firmness through the arms, this erectness in your spine, be a contrast to the softness of the touch of your fingers. And if you haven't already, go ahead and close your eyes. Feel a softening in the center of your eyebrows, a connection through the sit bones, and that relationship to the top of your head. Check once again. Still, the remaining open fingers are wide. The fingers that are touching are light. The triceps are engaging to strain the elbows. Right? And the spine is erect. Add attention. Right? And with this awareness to the details of your body, begin to now track your breath. And here at first, you're just noticing it. Right? Inhaling through your nose. Exhaling back out of the nose. Sense the expansion in your belly, the widening of the chest side to side, and the rising of the collarbones, rise and fall of your chest. See if you can begin to notice the breath as a three-dimensional activity. Up and down the spine, spiraling out to the sides, moving front and back. Then check once again, the fingers are engaged, the elbows are straight, the fingertips touching are soft, the spine is erect. Good, and then now from here, begin to notice and count how long it takes you to inhale. Number 2, lengthen the inhalation. Good, on your following breath, take that time it took you to inhale and add it to how long you hold the breath at the top. Again, if it took you 8 seconds to inhale, hold your breath for 8 seconds. Now begin to do the same on the exhalation. Taking your base of the inhale, applying it to the retention, transferring that into the exhale. Good, and then lastly, finally, evening out the final component of the breath, right? That hold at the end of your exhale. So now you have your baseline, the retention, the exhalation, and the hold at the bottom of the breath, all equal parts. Commit to the breath, the characteristics, the sensation, and fix your mind, your attention on the counting, the evenness, the balance, the integrity across all 4 sides of the breath. Trace that for 2 more minutes. Notice here this natural lift, this tallness, this erection of the spine, and this natural kind of folding at the front of the body as you exhale. To give you another anchoring point or guidepost, see if you can keep your collarbones lifted, right? Remain erect, nice and tall as you exhale all the way out. At the bottom, at the end of your exhale, see if you can draw your navel and suck it in towards your spine. Then lift the collar. Keep lifting your collar. About 1 more minute. In addition to that, right, at the top of your inhalation, once you're all filled all the way up, on your retention, see if you can press your belly outwards, like you're trying to get your belly as big as possible. And then now for 1 last minute, actually for another minute, see if you can add maybe 1 or 2 seconds to your baseline. So if it was 6, it's 7, maybe 8, all the way around. A little bit longer duration across all four sides of the breath. Keep the collar lifted on the hold, the retention. Keep your collar, your spine lifted as you exhale. Pull the navel in towards the spine at the bottom of the breath. Release all the breath out. Make way for the inhalation. At the top of your retention, push your belly outwards like you're super bloated in your stomach. Good. Match that exhale, same duration as the inhale. All four sides. Do 2 more rounds. Commit to sensing the straightness of your arms, mirroring the straightness in your fingers, in the spine, in the clearness of the breath. Good. And then from here, just one more last minute, allow your breath to come back to its natural rhythm, right? So don't mind the duration anymore. Don't worry about holding the breath. Notice the breath as it naturally flows in and out through the body. And then sense there too, right? Just noticing here, even without intentionally holding those breaths, that there is always those spaces in between, with this natural transition from inhale to exhale, right? The kumbhaka, and this natural turn and change from exhale to inhale. Good. And then now from here, keeping your eyes closed, just go ahead and place your hands across your heart, right? Right hand on the heart, left hand on top of the hand, right hand. Good. Now press your palms together. Take your thumb knuckles, rest them in the center of your eyebrows, and focus your attention on that sensation, right? This very physical sensation in the center of your eyebrows. And with this very intentional focus, everything else begins to fall out of focus. Good. On your next exhalation, bring your arms back to our starting points, down at your knees, on your laps. Touch a random finger to your thumb. And sense that imprint of your thumbs in the center of your eyebrows. See if you can rest in that sensation. This information from the body. And then on your next inhale, just keeping your eyes pretty still, right? You just softly open the eyes. Remain still for a few moments. And allow now yourself to transition out of meditation. Eyes dilate, blink the eyes a few times. We're going to watch Annie's introduction and overview of movement principle number 3. But before we continue on with the movement principles, just a very quick overview of what we've covered so far. right? We started off with movement principle number one, balancing the spine. And that's primarily, we were doing that on the sagittal plane or the front and back plane, right? So what that looks like in the body is flexion of the spine and extension of the spine, right? And the effort and return of that is the effort is to push the back of your body into the front of your body and press the front of your body into the back, right? So that there's this um, uh, equal parts give and take to create structural integrity in your spine. So that's kind of our base, the base for everything. Then we put our attention around the pelvis and it moving across multiple planes, right? Movement principle 2A is when the thighs, or a key idea to remember for movement principle 2 is that the thighs, right, your femurs, kind of dictate or inform, right, the thigh bones inform the positioning of your pelvis, right? So if you're, like we saw in movement principle number one, if the thigh, if the hip is in flexion, it tends to tuck the pelvis and then therefore rounds your back or flexes your spine. Now, when the thigh and the hip is in extension, that tends to tip the pelvis forward or create an anterior tilt. And then that will begin to create this kind of extension in the spine, right? And then for 2A, when one thigh is externally rotated, right, it'll begin to pull the entire structure in that direction, right? So the return for that, or the effort would be to engage the muscles on the outside of your thigh, your butt muscles, basically, particularly your glute medius, right? The most lateral muscles on your outer hip. That is what's going to turn your thigh outwards, right? So that's the effort. And then the return would be, right, if you keep turning this and the hips aren't stable, it's going to turn that way. So the return is to take this opposite thigh and then press the root of your thigh back into your pelvis, right? So the pelvis is stable and there's clear rotation in the leg. That's 2A. 2B now is when one foot is planted on the floor and the other one is higher than the left, right? So if I have my right foot's flat on the ground, my left leg is lifted, you're already going to begin to see here in Indiana bones that when this side is down, this side starts to lift up, right? So it becomes uneven side to side. And you see this in our daily, everyday actions or movements like walking, right? You take a step, one foot's planted, the other foot's moving forward, right? The other foot's planted, the other one's moving forward. And that tends to wiggle the pelvis side to side. As far as yoga poses go, right? You see this pose, Padahasta, right? We do it oftentimes with a strap, or more commonly, if you can grab hold of your big toe, you're like this. So this one leg, this right leg on our skeleton is on the floor. This leg is lifted. So this pelvis, this left side pelvis is going to be lifted, tilted up. How do we reposition and guide the hips? With the thigh. So you take this lifted leg's thigh and push it down, and that's going to begin to balance out that left side again. Now, if you push that hip too far down, right? If it's too much effort, right? If I push this hip too much, it'll start to swing my butt out to the other side, right? So the return would be to take this outside hip and then squeeze it back to the middle, right? So there's always this kind of adjustment, and then you look. Adjustment, and then you look, right? You look at what you just did and how that impacted something else, right? And it's one thing to be in that position and you're intentionally doing it, right? But if you're unaware of it, then you kind of ask yourself, if I'm unaware of this imbalance, what other things is it impacting, right? And therefore also unaware or unconscious, right? So that's kind of the mission of the yogi, is to be awake, right? And this is kind of our introduction to being alive and truly awake, right? Can we, even at the very gross level of our physical body, be aware of what we're doing with our body, right? And it's kind of a nice, good gateway into becoming aware of our kind of psychological and physiological and spiritual landscapes, right? The body. It's a nice little gateway into kind of understanding that. Um, and then movement principle number C is now when you do, or 2C is when you do all of these things, right? So there's um, an effort or an action that's pulling the pelvis on the sagittal plane. It's yanking it on the coronal plane side to side. And now it's also twisting, right? Or it's rotating. Um, and we don't have to get too deep into all of the different directions and angles, but essentially when you twist, we often get all three kind of dimensions and aspects of these planes when we do the twist. Okay, so that's a review, 1 through and all the subsets of movement principle number 2. Today we're going to look at movement principle number 3. This principle has a lot of just kind of general awesomeness when, as far as like applications to life. This is one of the most practical physical understandings. Oftentimes when you hear people say like, oh, I don't know about yoga, I can't even bend over and touch my toes, right? How could I even practice that? First off, that's not necessarily the point. Second, you're probably exactly the type of person who should practice yoga because you cannot do that, right? And thirdly, based off of movement principle number 3, mobility in the pelvis is super critical and fundamental to your physical well-being. One of the prime reasons for what is the words for it? Basically, like, when you get older, the main reason why old people cannot take care of themselves is because they start having problems in their hips, right? They can't stand or sit down by themselves anymore. They're more susceptible to falling because there's no more coordination or mobility and awareness in the pelvis, right? So, and that could be a result of simply just because they're getting older, right? It could be a result of an injury. It can also just be because you don't use your hips and you lose connection and awareness to it, right? And an example that most people can relate to is this kind of losing this physical awareness is like, if you fell asleep on the side of your arm or in a weird way in your neck, or if you're kind of sitting uncomfortably for a long time and then you stand up and then you're just kind of like, oh, this feels weird in this area, right? Imagine that that's applied to your pelvis or applied to anything that you're not kind of aware of. You just kind of lose connection to it. And then, of course, you're not going to want to move it because it's like creaky and uncomfortable, so you just kind of begin to layer all of this unconscious tension and kind of like just avoiding or ignoring that area, so it can catch up to you at the end of towards the twilight of your life. And that's, cited as one of the main reasons why old people can't take care of themselves. So that's why people end up in the hospital or end up in like facilities and stuff like that, because they cannot stand or sit down anymore. Right? You cannot wipe your own butt when you use the restroom. So with that in mind, let's dive a little bit deeper. Annie, I'm gonna share my screen. We'll watch this video. It's about 18 minutes long, and then we'll jump right into testing out this idea in our bodies. Okay. So grab your props and your blocks and straps and stuff. Have that to the side, and we'll test out some of these ideas that she talks about. Okay, cool. Share my screen. Right. And then I'm sure like if you've ever had a personal trainer or you read like, oh, 10 best exercises to do, or whatever pops up on your social media feeds, oftentimes you'll see some kind of squatting variation, right? If you talk to a personal trainer, they're like, "Oh, we'll work on your squatting and on your deadlift." It's functional, these functional movements, But what does any of those things really mean? Literally, right? It's not just so like, oh, I can deadlift or I can squat and do this and that. Um, it is for your lifetime health, right? Your lifetime health. It'll awareness of the pelvis and understanding the mechanics and how to kind of support and nourish it is very, very vital to your life. All right, so here it is.
Namaste, yogis. Let's jump right into movement principle 3. And this is the movement principle that teaches us how to approach forward bending. And as you know, forward bending is kind of a ubiquitous thing in yoga. You've heard people say, I can't do yoga, I can't touch my toes. And as you know, those are the very people we want in our yoga classes. And I alluded to this earlier, but I really feel that this activity of forward bending in a safe way, in a healthy way, is one of the great gifts that Yoga Asana gives us. And of course, there are many. But on the physical level, to learn how to fold the body at the hip as opposed to rounding the spine is one of the healthiest things we can give our students. Many people, and I know you've heard, I certainly don't know the statistics, but it's easy to challenge your spine over the years if all of your bending, and in particular lifting things up, comes from sort of the spinal area as opposed to being able to bend the knees and fold at the hips. And so this movement principle gives us the tools to bring awareness to this movement and also to really teach how to do it well. On a basic level, the effort is having a sense of lifting the pelvis up and folding it over the thighs. The return being contracting the hamstrings or offering some resistance to pelvic forward bending by literally drawing the sitting bones down. So again, the opposite action, the opposite activity. Now, one of the things that this movement principle teaches us is so well, like maybe better than any of the others, is the idea that to have clear conscious movement, we choose to stabilize one part and move another. What's interesting about this movement principle is that we could stabilize one end or the other, and we have to choose. Generally speaking, if you're standing, the legs, thus the thigh bone, is going to be stabilized, if we know how. And it is the pelvis that will lift and fold over the thighs. If, however, we're lying on our backs, think of Supta Padangusthasana, then we stabilize the pelvis and the lower back and move specifically the thigh relative to the pelvis. And this ability to have the sensitivity to choose what is stabilizing and what is moving is one of the aspects of this movement principle that gives us longevity. Both that attitude of making a clear and conscious choice, but also specifically in these body parts to be able to stabilize the pelvic bones and the lumbar spine and that relationship as we create hip flexion is one of the most important skills we need as we age. Think of sitting and standing up from sitting. Think of leaning over to pick up a grocery bag or a child. There are many instances leaning forward to grab something off a table. All of that is well served by this movement principle. So it's not just for asana. Okay, so let's get clear about what hip flexion is and what spinal flexion is. Hip flexion is just that. The thigh bone in the pelvis, remember it's a ball and socket joint, the thigh bone, the longest bone in the body. So let's make this a hip socket, yeah? And this, the head of my thigh bone. which is somewhat ball-shaped. And it sits in that socket. And the hip socket is part of the pelvis. Several bones come together to make each hip socket, the pelvic bones. And so to stabilize the pelvis and to move the hip looks like this. This would be me sitting and lifting one leg up. If, however, I'm standing, I'm going to stabilize this thigh bone and I'm going to turn the pelvis over the thigh. Right? So that's the difference of what are you stabilizing? What are you moving? I'm going to stand up and show you a little more specifically what I mean here. So if I'm in, we'll call it Tadasana, but just standing will do, and I want to go and pick something up on the floor, very often what we see is this kind of an action. And we grab something, and you can see how round my spine is. And then to lift something up and use these muscles is actually quite a bit of strain on the lower back for almost everybody. Look at the difference from seeing something I want to pick up and folding at the hips. Now, because it's down there really far, I'm also going to bend my knees. But can you see that this is hip flexion, knee flexion, ankle flexion, and my spine is supported in its neutral curves. The big picture here is that the muscles of the hips, in particular the gluteal muscles, are big, strong muscles. And that's what we want to rely on. So to be able to distinguish that hip flexion from spinal flexion is what this movement principle is all about. And just a note there, it's not that spinal flexion is bad or wrong for us. Not at all. We want to be able to move the spine in all directions. But to use spinal flexion to lift heavy objects or to have spinal flexion be our default mode is not what we want. We want to develop the capacity to move at the hips for many, many, many life tasks. So that's what this is about. Luckily, there are many, many poses in yoga that teach the difference. And if you'll think, I think you'll all remember what Uttanasana, the forward bend with straight legs, is. And those of you who practice Vinyasa yoga, very often in a sun salutation, we'll fold over in Uttanasana and then we'll go to Ardha Uttanasana, which is the lengthening of the spine up out of the hip joints. And in effect, we're creating a little bit of spinal extension. Now, depending upon your flexibility, it won't be a lot of spinal extension, but it will be spinal extension as we flex at the hips. So I hope you heard hip flexion, spinal extension. These are the two ends of the continuum. And this principle of doing one thing while also doing its opposite. Can I fold forward bend at the hips as I extend my spine? Is that combination of one and its opposite? Which again, smart flow yoga, and my belief is that all good yoga has a little bit of one thing and its opposite. I'm going to pause here and go back to one of the philosophical ideas that I hope you're aware of at this point. We discussed it earlier. And this is a beautiful little saying, which is in Sanskrit, Pratipaksha Bhavanam. And Pratipaksha Bhavanam literally translates pretty close to the cultivation of the opposite. You know the word bhav or bhava, and it sometimes is used as devotion or meditation or intention. But I think a really good way of translating it in this particular case is the cultivation of. And Pratipaksha is the opposite. And I think we've all done this just in life, you know, whereas when we're feeling sad, we try to cultivate positive thoughts. You know, that's the sort of simplest version that we probably all have experienced. But my belief is that in yoga, this concept, Pratipakshabhavanam, is a practice. It's an ongoing practice. And in the case of yoga asana, once again, like we said with abhyasa vairagya, with effort and return to center, it's a way of looking at desire. It's a way of looking at fear. Because as we approach even the best desire, if it goes too far, then we are going to set ourselves up for some kind of suffering, aren't we? If we follow our fear, then we are going to suffer from something that probably looks like being stuck, from not being able to enter into the world joyously, creatively, which is who we are in our hearts. Now, what does this have to do with forward bending? Good question. My view is that if we can move in the direction of folding forward, but somewhere in our hearts we remember its opposite of opening back, then we live in a state of balance, or at least in a state of cultivating balance. In yoga, we often say every good forward bend has a little back bend in it. Conversely, every good back bend has a little forward bend in it. And this has a goal of keeping us from going too far, from remembering where we came from, and continuing to seek balance in everything we do, in this case, in cultivating deep but really healthy forward bends. Now, as we forward bend more and more deeply, for those of you in particular who are very, very flexible in the hamstring, gastrocnemius, the backs of the legs, if we find ourselves going too far, too quickly, too far, then what will happen is, as with many, many joints, so back to my hip socket and my thigh bone, if I take that forward bend more and more deeply, the muscle that attaches at the sit bone and goes down to the knee, and in fact below the knee, some of the fibers, the hamstring group. The problem with the hamstrings is that the attachment, the tendon that attaches to the sit bone, is easily stressed when we go too far in a forward bend, especially if we're moving quickly and strongly. So the return to center in this case is, for many of us, simply contracting the hamstrings. To turn the body, the back of the leg, on as we fold in the opposite direction is to make a dynamic, active pose. I think we could say that all yoga poses outside of Shavasana should have a dynamic, activated quality to them, a dynamic stillness. So not just in transition do we want to activate the hamstring as we move into a forward bend, but even as we hold in the pose, whether that's 3 breaths, 5 breaths, or longer, we want to keep this dynamic rather than hanging in the joint, hanging on that hamstring tendon, which in particular for very flexible people is something that can be stressed quite easily, frankly. So we want to be careful with that. And the way to be careful is to keep it turned on. To turn a muscle on is to activate and use as many fibers of that muscle, including the tendons at either end, as opposed to just relying on the edge closest to where the movement occurs. So we'll look at that in our cueing, in the forward bends we do in our practice, which is coming up. And we'll think about that in our own practice at home. How deeply can I forward bend without losing the activation of the muscles at the back of the leg, hamstring, but also you'll find the calf muscle, the larger of the two, it's called the gastrocnemius, which also crosses the knee. These muscles stay engaged to keep us from taking it too far and stressing at the level of the tendons. Really, really helpful work. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to mention at this point, and this is the idea of it's called intrapelvic movement. So that sounds like a lot. And it's simply the idea that the bones of the pelvis actually have movement inside of them. While the pelvis may seem like this sturdy bowl of bone, it actually has a little bit of movement in it at a couple of different joints. Certainly where the top of the pelvis at the back meets the bottom of the lumbar spine, that joint is called S1L5. There is quite a bit of movement there, relatively speaking, but also the bones between the sacrum and the ilium, there's movement there. And these I want to highlight. There's a little bit of movement in other places at certain times, especially women, if you're pregnant, you get more movement. And I just would like to point out that that's why we have movement in the pelvis. So when a woman is getting ready to deliver the baby, and we won't get into all of the ins and outs of the hormones that come through that relax the ligaments, and the cartilage gets a little softer at this point necessarily. I mean, just think of how big a baby is and how small the pelvis is and the pelvic opening. Thank God for that movement. So it's kind of interesting when the baby starts to come down, when it approaches the time for delivery. If you think, I'll face sideways. If you think of a pelvis, here's the front of the pelvis. The belly button is about here. And the sacrum is the bone at the back of the pelvis. When the baby comes down, ideally head first, what happens is the pelvic bones open up, in a sense, at the top to allow room for the baby. And so the head of that sacral bone moves back a little bit, inviting the baby to come down into the birth canal. It's really quite remarkable. And as this happens, because the pelvis is its particular shape, and in particular the sacrum is sort of a wedge shape, the sitting bones at the bottom will actually come together. So let me say that again. As the head of the sacrum nods back, the sitting bones come together. But if you think of the baby coming down, the head coming down into the pelvis, the pelvic floor with the sitting bone closing remains closed, preparing the baby for the birth. Now, when it's time for mom to push the baby out, the head of the sacrum starts to nod forward, literally pushing the baby down into the birth canal. When the head of the sacrum moves forward, the two sitting bones spread apart from one another, inviting the baby to come out. And this is why we have so much movement in the pelvic bones. You might wonder why men have movement in the pelvic bones, and in fact, for the most part, they have less. But this is the reason we have intrapelvic movement. It's the miracle of birth. Having said that, if you're not giving birth and you don't have this relaxant running through your body, what most of us need to do is stabilize these bones. So we'll look at how forward bending, extreme forward bending, tends to create more and more of this movement of the sacrum and the sitting bones. And what we can do, especially you flexible people, can do to stabilize those bones while getting an optimal amount of hip flexion. And that really is the work, anatomically, philosophically, and longevity-wise, of movement principle 3. So we'll stop here. The next video, I'll bring Lucy in.
All right, buddies. Let's stop this share. Where did it go? Oh, start my video. I just don't have my video on. Can you see me now? Oh, here. Stop. There we are. Awesome. So that's overview of movement principle number 3. All right, a couple things to highlight is anatomically, we can look at it here on our skeleton. Let me do a close-up. right? So we're talking about hinging at the hip, right? You've often heard that, or that's a little bit more common kinesiology term is hip hinge, right? And in order to create this kind of flexion in the hip, right, there needs to be a little bit of separation in this socket, in this joint. So that's what Annie is referring to is you want to lift the pelvis, right, and create this kind of spaciousness between the thigh and the pelvis so that there's space for it to hinge. Right, this mannequin is in a fixed position, so I can't kind of turn the pelvis. But this is what she's talking about: the difference between being very specific about what you're stabilizing. Right, in this situation and orientation of our skeleton, I only have the option of the legs being stable. Right, so the legs are the thing that's stable, and so uh, uh, wait, is that right? The legs, yeah, when you're standing, the legs are the thing in a fixed position, right? Because it's in a closed chain position. The difference between an open and closed position is what is connected to the stable ground, right? So if so say for example here the legs are in a fixed position because they're standing on the floor, right? So this one leg is fixed, and then you begin to fold over, right? You got to lift the, oops, popped it off the scent. You got to lift. I need my child to assist me to hold this. But anyways, if you lift, you need to lift the thighs to create separation, and then the pelvis is what she was saying begins to kind of roll over and hinge over the top of the thigh, right? Because if it's kind of like stuck together, there's going to be very limited movement. So our work is to create this space so that it begins to fold over. Okay, so then now when the orientation is different, right? If say for example, Supta Para Hasta, when we're lying down on the floor and like using the strap and stuff, lifting our leg up, then the pelvis is the thing that's on the ground, and that's the thing that's um, in a fixed position, right? So now it's the pelvis, it's in a fixed position, or here like this, laying down on the ground, and then it's the thigh now that's moving, right? And we'll take that right now and kind of test that out and see how that feels like in our body, right? So, but basically, the effort is to create this stability, understand what is stable, right? Um, and the return to center now is then, you know, if you take that too far, you're going to begin to stretch too much the back of your legs. Um, a little bit of the calves, some of your lower back, but also um, for most, mainly the hamstring, right? So we want to engage the very thing that we are stretching, right? The hamstrings. Um, and a couple more things to highlight that Annie was talking about is the importance of this hip hinge, right? Like when you're going down to pick something up off the floor. Generally, that's fine, right? That's fine if you start to, when you like in like infrequently, it's okay to like kind of do this. It's not wrong, but when you begin to compound that, say for a long duration over a longer period of time, um, then that begins to create this kind of unhealthy movement pattern in your body. Um, and you know, if anybody has ever done any weightlifting, like powerlifting, deadlifts in particular, um, that's the shape of it, right? You got a hinge at your hip. There's a hinge at your knees. There's a hinge in your ankles, but the spine remains neutral, right? If you've ever seen anybody, or if you've ever done this yourself and try to like lift something heavy off the floor like this, most likely, if not immediately, the next day you're going to feel something happening in your lower back, right? So we got to keep the spine neutral, right? So that it can bear, especially if you're going to add load or weight to your spine, is that it's in a neutral position, right? It's in a prime position where it's all stacked up on top of each other. So the parts that are meant to move and carry this load, and the parts that need to be supported and stable need to be very, very clear, right? That's even more and more important if you're lifting weights, but it can happen in everyday things. Like Annie was saying, if you're picking up groceries, or if you have a dog, or if you're helping an elder who's bedridden, right? Like, are you trying to carry somebody? If anybody's like a nurse there, these are things that they'll teach you how to like move people, right? So you gotta keep your spine neutral and balanced, and use the big muscles of your butt to maneuver and move around, right? Versus the smaller attachments of the erector spinae on the back of your body. Um, so that's that. That's part of the important part. And then towards the end, she was talking about, we'll talk now about nutation, right? Nutation and counter nutation. And the example that she was giving and kind of our natural design, or the reason why, is because of childbirth, right? And to clarify that, because it's a very useful understanding and application when we're doing these forward bends, is that when we're talking about nutation here, we're looking at the positioning of the sacrum, right? So this kind of triangular centerpiece bone. And then, as we know, it's flanked by the ilium, right, or the hip bones. And then another landmark to get familiar with is the ischial tuberosity, or your sit bones, right? And you're familiar with this if you yourself or somebody with a bony butt has sat on your lap and you're like, dude, your butt is so sharp. That's the sit bones, right? So in nutation, what we're looking at here is the sacrum, right? When it's nutating, the head of the sacrum tips forward, right? So when the sacrum begins to tip forward or towards the front of the body, the tailbone naturally will start to get flung back, right? So the tailbone begins to tip back, the head begins to nod forward. So you can kind of remember it like this, nutation, nodding, right? So it's like the head is nodding forward. Counter nutation, actually another thing to note there, right? When in nutation, also the sit bones begin to splay apart, right? And using Annie's example of childbirth, that's when the head is about to crown and it's in position. So naturally it makes sense. It's like the head of the sacrum is kind of scooping the head and pushing it down. The tailbone is moving out of the way, and then the sit bones are spreading so that there's a clear passage for the baby to come out, right? Now, when the baby is just kind of getting into position, it makes sense for the head of the sacrum to kind of tip back so that the head can fit in this kind of like little basket of the pelvis. The tailbone tucks under so that on the bottom part, or the inferior end, there's this kind of catch, right? And then the sit bones squeeze together, right? It's just kind of preparing this area for the head to be received, right? And that is counter nutation. How does this apply to forward bending? Well, let's check it out, right? Oftentimes, go ahead and stand up now, and we'll feel in our bodies what nutation and counter nutation feels like, and then we'll apply it to our folds, right? So go ahead and stand up. Plant your feet on the floor. And then now from here, go ahead and turn your toes outwards, all the way out, right? So heel to heel, toes pointing outwards. And then sense here, right, that the tailbone is tucking, right? It's almost kind of like pushing your shoulders forward. Your back is rounding, right? So sense that. Notice those kind of key points. The head of the sacrum, right, is getting pushed back. The sit bones are squeezing together, and then your tailbone is sucking. It's like scooping like this, right? It's scooping under. Okay, good. And then now turn your toes in as much as you can. Your knees turn inwards. And then you can't help but your butt starts to stick back, right? So then now this is nutation. The top of your head begins to push, the sacrum begins to push forward, right? It's almost like your belly is getting pushed forward. Your tailbone, and therefore your pelvis and your butt, seems to start to stick back. And then your sit bones begin to splay apart. Okay? So oftentimes what happens is, if there's no movement and awareness in the pelvis, when you ask somebody to pick something up off the floor, right? Oftentimes they'll just start to round their spine. They'll be like, oh, can't reach it, right? Try to reach something on the floor without moving your pelvis. It's impossible, right? But then now, if you initiate that action in your pelvis, right? Put your hands here at the top of your thighs, right? Right at the root of the thighs. And then you don't even have to squeeze your muscles or anything. Just use your fingers here and then just slide your thighs back, right? And then notice here that you haven't done anything with your spine. The same orientation. When you're standing, take your thighs, press them back. Then your knees will naturally begin to bend. And then now you also have dorsiflexion in your ankles. So there's flexion in the ankles, flexion in the knees, flexion in your hips. And you just keep sliding your thighs back, 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 back. And eventually, you get closer and closer to the floor without doing anything to your spine. Right? And understand. Okay, so then now how this applies to when we're doing forward, any deep folding. And the blueprint pose for moving principle number 3 is Uttanasana, or forward fold. Right? Forward fold is that, okay, let's try this again. Take your toes, point them out to the sides. This will cue and trigger a very extreme form of counter nutation, right? Tailbone sucking, head is rocking back, your sit bones are squeezing together, and it's like, you're not even squeezing your outer butt cheeks, but you feel them engaging to turn your thighs up. Okay, so then now with the toes turned out, try to reach for the floor. Try to bend over and touch the ground. You can't. I can't even go any further than this, right? Gonna get stuck. Toes pointing outwards. It's super hard to touch and bend over. Right? Now, take the toes, point them inwards, create that kind of extreme now nutation. Sit bones are splaying apart, tailbone's now going to slide back, head of the sacrum's pushed forward, and then begin to hinge at your hip. Maybe for some of you, this is even further than you've ever gone before, right? Turning your toes all the way in. This is a deep exaggeration. Cool. And then go ahead and stand. Right? So then now when the feet are in neutral, imagine that you're trying to turn your toes in and try to slide your heels apart. Right? It's like you have ropes or clasp around your ankles, and then you're pushing outwards. Right? So keeping your feet in neutral, can you from the inside of your body begin to cue that nutation, right, without doing this exaggeration with the toes pointing in, feet underneath your hips, spread your heels, try to spread outwards through your heels, spread your toes. Feel already the stability in the pelvis and this kind of direction of the tailbone sliding back, the sit bones getting wider, hands on those hips, and then see if you can just kind of hinge forward a little bit. Just a little bit. And then a little bit more. And then remember that balance of the spine. Don't let your spine collapse. Lift your chest and then fold a little bit more. You'll notice for some, right, if there's tightness or unawareness, your butt's going to start to rock back. I want you to try to keep your butt right over your feet. It's a lot. A little bit more. It's a lot. It is. Right? If you notice yourself rocking back, don't shy away from the challenge of it. Keep your hips right over your feet. Spread your toes. Keep lifting, extending your spine. Engage the back of your hamstrings like you're trying to push your knees forward. Right? It's different from just bending your knees. There's something there giving you a little bit of resistance. Maybe you come about halfway, whatever that means for you. And then again, notice what's happening in your hips. Don't rock your hips back. Slowly begin to stand all the way back up. It's a lot. Stand all the way up. Don't rock your butt back and stand and swing your hips. Keep your pelvis stable. Stand, 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 stand. Keep driving the heels away from one another. And then you're standing all the way. I'm sweating, and all we're doing is hinging at the hip one time. Okay, so that's the example of, did you have a question, Chris? No, you're like, no, yeah, I confirm this is challenging. Okay, so, so that's the example of when the legs are, yeah, it's definitely deep. So that's an example of when the legs, right? When the legs are the thing that's stable because we're not moving them. They're fixed to the floor. So what we need to do is lift the pelvis to create that space and then begin to hinge or hinge over that thigh, right? So the legs is straight and the pelvis is the thing that's moving, right? It's not the spine getting, I don't know how to do that, but it's not the spine that's flexing. Your spine remains as neutral as possible, but your hips begin to rotate and move around this ball of your leg. Okay, let's try that one more time, the standing one. But this time I want you to use blocks. Okay, have the blocks at the highest height. Okay, set your feet a little bit about as wide as your hips, right? Directly underneath your hips. Spread your toes and then start already. You want to make sure that the outside edges of your feet are parallel, right? That they're not pointing outwards. And oftentimes people want to line up with the big toes. Think of it more of the second big toe. Try to point the second big toe straight ahead. Spread those toes and then the feet's fixed to the floor. Try to, like you're scraping gum off your heel. You're trying to scrape it out to the sides, left and right. Feel your sit bones splaying, the head of your sacrum pushing forward, nutation, right? Hands on the hips. Take an inhale, get really tall, like you're lifting. Imagine your hips lifting off your thighs. And then as you exhale, fold a little bit. Engage and be aware of the legs again. Inhale, lift the collar. And then exhale, fold a little bit more. You'll notice that your butt's going to want to rock back. Keep it tipping forward. Open the front of the body. Fold a little bit more. Spread your toes. Actively push the heels away from each other. Lift the collar. Fold a little bit more. If you can reach your blocks, put the hands on the blocks. High on your fingertips. Lift your chest. Take an inhale. Then as you exhale, draw the tailbone or engage your pelvic floor to pull the sit bones back together, right? As you're actively trying to spread them apart. Take a couple breaths here. This is Ardha or half forward fold. So half forward fold is really a good example of hinging specifically at your hip without flexing your spine. The spine, breathe into your natural curves. All right, take one more inhale here. Keep spreading your toes. And then now, lengthen your chest forward towards the floor and then fold towards the ground. Engage the backs of your legs. Good. Let's do that a couple of times. Hands on those blocks. Inhale, half forward fold. Neutralize your spine. Bring the spine to neutral. Keep lifting your sit bones up. As you exhale, fold. Wow. One more. Inhale, half forward fold. Neutral spine. Now deep hinge in the hip and some spinal flexion. Good. And then come back to that half fold. Take an inhale. Keep your hips hovering over your feet. Exhale, hands on the hips. Don't let your butt rock back. Inhale, stand all the way up. Good morning. I think that's what they're called. Good mornings, right? So that's when the legs are fixed. Okay, now let's try it. Get your straps. You're gonna lie down on your back. Oh, we got like 3 minutes. Let's just do this fast. So then we have something to build off of on Wednesday. Okay, so real quick, lay down on the floor, bend your right knee, step your left foot into the strap. Okay, and then go ahead and straighten that leg, left leg up towards the sky. So remember now here, your pelvis is the thing that's stable and your leg is the thing that's moving, right? So to stabilize the pelvis, remember that action, spread your toes, engage your hamstrings. Don't let the back of the knees yawn. See if you can keep it nice and soft in the back of the knees, right? Like you're trying to bend your knees, but your leg is remain straight. And then now notice here, take your left hand, slide it underneath your lower back. Now pull the strap, pull your leg towards your face. Okay, now you have flexion in your hip. In addition to that, now if you have your hand there in your lower back, you'll feel your back pushing into your hand because you've gone too far, right? Now it's no longer hip flexion, it is also now flexion in your spine. Okay, so then now here, keeping your hand behind your back, slowly begin to bring the leg towards the floor, right? You're decreasing the flexion in your hip. And then as a result, your whole pelvis, because your leg is moving, right, your hip is going to start to roll towards the left foot or away from your head. And then that pressure, right, on your hand will begin to disappear, the natural curve of your lower back. Now for some, right, if you bring the leg down, the back arches a lot for whatever various reasons, or I won't get too much into that. But just notice that. What happens when you bring your leg up and you go too far beyond hip flexion, your spine begins to get yanked into flexion as well, right? So find that for yourself. We'll just do that for one last minute. Bring the leg all the way down, feel the natural curve in your lower back, spread your left toes, engage your left hamstring, and then begin to bring your leg up and stop before your lower back begins to flatten into your hand. And then if you're super, super stretchy, right, some of you might be able to bring the leg past 90 degrees, right? If you're super stretchy, engage the back of your legs. Engage your quad, hamstrings, engage your calves. Right? And then if you're not feeling anything, right, keep engaging that. Begin to bring the leg up a little bit higher towards the face. Don't let your left hand get crushed by your spine. Good, and then now straighten your right leg on the floor. And then remember the work of movement principle 2B. Keep dropping this left thigh so that the hips are even on the left and right side. Or feel like you're sucking your right thigh back up into your hip. Cool. Okay, and then bend that left knee. I believe it's now 4:20. It's so much fun. There's too many things to do. I encourage you to do the right side if you have the time, right? But I understand if you need to run. If you have the time to stick around, I'll cue the right side, right? Maybe like another 5 minutes or so, right? But if you have to go, fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. Message me if you have any questions or concerns, insights, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you're sticking around, let's do the right side, okay? So bend that left knee, hug the right knee in, loop your right leg. Okay, and then straighten that leg up, and then begin to pull that leg, right? You already kind of get a sense of what to look for, and I just want to give you a warning. It's going to be different on both sides, right? So don't just assume that like, oh, okay, on my left side, I was able to touch my head with my foot. You'll be surprised, right? There's a difference between right and left. So just notice that. Low back flattening. Okay, and then the strap in the left hand, both of them, both ends of the strap, and then slide your right hand underneath your back. In the lumbar area to be specific. Right? And then pull that leg again. You'll feel your hips maybe not even touching the floor. right? They're rolling towards your face. Your lower back is flat. Hip flexion and spinal flexion. Spread your toes, begin to lower your leg towards the floor. And then, if you're not engaging anything, you'll feel already this release of pressure in the lower back, in the hand, right? Keep spreading your right toes, spinning your inner thigh. So that spin of the inner thigh, it's that same feeling of trying to spread the gum off of your heels left and right. That's what I mean, trying to turn your thigh in. Good. And then slowly begin to bring that leg all the way back up. Engage your hamstring. Try to imagine that you have your heel on a table and you're trying to push your heel down into the table. And you're trying to bend the right knee, but your leg is fixed in a cast, right? Engage the back of the leg. Bring the leg up even more. Find that edge before it begins to turn into something else, right? Before it begins to pull your spine out of balance. Keep the spine neutral and see how much flexion and range you have in your hip. Keep spreading your right toes. Keep spreading that gum off your right heel to the right. Remember, spreading the sit bone. And then from here, straighten your left leg on the floor. Spread both toes. Just like if when we had both feet on the floor, try to spread the heels apart like you had the gum on your heel. And then suck your left thigh back up into your hip. That's the work of movement principle 2B. It'll automatically drop your right hip and level it with the left. Firm the outer left hip. Feel really strong and balanced in the spine. And you feel this action throughout the right heel, all the way down to the connection of your right sit bone, very clearly. Good. And then bend your right knee, release that strap, let your legs rest on the floor for a few moments. And just sit there with the tingling, right? Notice that sensation in your legs, up the hips. Cool. All right, friends. Thank you so much. All of you stuck around. That's movement principle number 3. We'll